This is AMTV. Hello there everyone, and welcome to part 27 of this series looking at the history and impact of Doctor Who viewing figures. If you're joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome to you. We hope you stick around for future instalments and check out our previous episodes. We've covered the entire run of the classic series, which can be enjoyed episodically by season or as compilations by Doctor. But for now, sit back, relax, and join me once again as we delve back into the wonderfully niche world of Doctor Who viewing figures. Our destination? The early days of the wilderness years. The year is 1990, and for the first time in 27 years, a new series of Doctor Who was nowhere to be seen on television screens across the country. After the various trials and tribulations of the late 1980s, news that the show would not be immediately returning for the 1990s was confirmed first to leading stars Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred, and then to the press and public soon after. On the BBC's part, anticipating the backlash that had ensued when Michael Grade had tried to axe the show in 1985, the term cancellation wasn't utilised. Instead, the statement was that the show was resting, that it would have a few years off air and return to TV when the time felt right, or when a new, exciting direction had been found for the 1990s. So, Doctor Who was no more, right? Well, not exactly. Despite there being no new series on TV, Doctor Who was far from being all over. Over the next 15 years, the franchise would thrive in the form of a monthly magazine, countless book releases giving us new adventures and stories set with past Doctors, a steady stream of home video releases, countless new audio adventures, and so much more. Now, for the record, I won't be covering absolutely everything that came out during the wilderness years here in this one video. This is a series primarily about viewing figures after all, and despite their scarcity in this period, we'll touch on what we can. These include numerous repeats of classic adventures, which we have touched on briefly before, but I'll reference them with a little more depth. But rest assured, I won't be completely ignoring all the different pieces of expanded media that came out, as they were vital for ensuring Doctor Who's survival through the 1990s, the 21st century, and beyond. So, where shall we begin? Well, for those who were enthralled by the recent adventures of the 7th Doctor and Ace, they actually didn't have to wait too long before they could be seen on TV again. On the 21st of November, 1990, less than a year since the concluding episode of Season 26, the Doctor, Ace, together with K9 and new friend Cedric, appeared in Search Out Space, a special crossover with the children's educational programme Search Out Science. The Time Lord is the host of The Ultimate Challenge, the biggest game show in the universe, with his companions being tasked to answer questions about space, with severe punishments awaiting them should they answer incorrectly. Now, this is just a nice bit of fun. Sylvester and Sophie play this absolutely in character, and it's great to hear John Leeson voicing K9 again, the first time he'd done so on TV since the 20th anniversary special, The Five Doctors. I searched high and low for the viewing figures of this little oddity, and sadly, no results have yielded themselves. Whilst I'm sure documents do exist, it's important to remember that not every programme's viewing figures are talked about as much as Doctor Who. Given that this was a children's programme, I can't imagine the numbers reached extraordinary heights. That's not a stab at the special's quality or children's TV in general, but it is known that children's programmes generally garner a fraction of the audience size of even the lowest performing drama, for example. Had Search Out Space, say, had roughly 1 million or just under that tuning in, I'd say that wouldn't be a bad result given the context. But despite the drought of new adventures, don't think that the past 26 years of Who on television simply went untouched. The home video market was growing from strength to strength with every passing year, with VCR decks becoming gradually more affordable to consumers. Doctor Who stories had been issued on the format since 1983, with a heavily edited compilation edition of Revenge of the Cybermen being the first release around the time of the 20th anniversary. Since then, VHS releases of Doctor Who had been limited to a few releases per year. However, starting from 1990, fans would see classic adventures be issued at a more consistent rate. Stories that saw a VHS release in 1990 are An Unearthly Child, The War Games, The Dalek Invasion of Earth, The Mind Robber, The Five Doctors, The Brain of Morbius, The Web Planet, and The Dominators. This year was mainly occupied by black and white adventures, giving many younger fans a chance to experience those 1960s stories for the very first time, including the serial that started it all and the 10-part epic that was the swan song for the black and white era. Suffice to say, if the Doctor and friends taking part in the Ultimate Challenge didn't meet your expectations, you were going to be waiting a fair while before you'd see any further adventures on your TV screen. Sure, you could enjoy a gradually expanding array of classic stories on VHS, but 1990 was coming to an end, and despite rumours flying about the fandom every other week, there was no concrete confirmation that Doctor Who was returning to BBC One. The year is now 1991, a year which arguably marked a turning point for Doctor Who, at least in terms of its expanded media. For nearly 20 years, alongside the TV series, novelised adaptations of those adventures had been consistently released under the Target Books label. Initially reprinting a trilogy of First Doctor adventures, which first hit shop shelves in 1973, the Target line and brand only grew from strength to strength, with Doctor Who being the crown jewel of its arsenal. However, as the 1990s rolled in, Target was quickly running out of television stories to adapt. Throughout 1990 and 1991, the last few Seventh Doctor adventures were novelised, as well as a few stories from the 1960s. The final regular release, The Pescatons, was an adaptation of a vinyl LP release from back in the mid-70s, so it's fair to say that available content to novelise was well and truly running dry. Target had attempted to release a line of original Who books back in the 1980s. The Companions of Doctor Who, as it was titled, saw brand new adventures for Vislaw Turlough, Harry Sullivan, and the Doctor's faithful dog, K9, though this release was technically an adaptation of A Girl's Best Friend, the sole episode of attempted spin-off K9 and Company. Sadly, these releases didn't get a new strand of original adventures off the ground, but by 1991, times had changed, and if the Doctor and Ace's adventures weren't going to continue on TV, then they may as well continue in print. With Virgin Books taking on the task, the new adventures of Doctor Who first hit bookshops all across the country in the summer of 1991. Picking up where the TV series left off, the Seventh Doctor and Ace continued their travels in the Time Vern saga, setting the more serious, mature tone that these stories would become known for. Whereas the Target books had primarily been aimed at children, the Virgin New Adventures, or VNAs as they would become known, were geared towards older readers, some of them becoming infamous for their use of strong language and even sexual elements. The Time Worm saga was a hit, being released throughout the latter half of 1991, and would ensure that the range would continue into 1992 and beyond, keeping fans happy and intrigued by these brand new adventures, whilst the future of Doctor Who on TV remained ever more a mystery. Meanwhile, in the world of home video, Doctor Who continued to expand the amount of releases fans could get their hands on in a year. The classic adventures to hit shop shelves in 1991 were The Curse of Fenric, The Crotons, Planet of the Spiders, City of Death, The Mask of Mandragora, The Three Doctors, The Deadly Assassin, and a twin pack comprising of The Sontaran Experiment and Genesis of the Daleks. Alongside these 9 stories, there were also 2 extra VHS releases from the BBC. These were the Hartnell years and the Troughton years, special tapes that retrospectively looked at the early years of the programme, complete with select episodes and new linking material featuring Sylvester McCoy and John Pertwee respectively. 1991 would also mark the first year in which an extended edition of a Who story would be released. The Curse of Fenric included several extra minutes of new material, proudly boasting so on the box art. It was the first time a Doctor Who story had received this treatment on home video, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But as 1991 drew to a close, a prospective season 27 of the TV series was still very much a pipe dream. However, one summer's night, on the 26th of August, fans had been treated to a very special screening over on BBC Two. As part of the Lime Grove story, taking a look at the historic BBC studios, the pilot episode of Doctor Who was aired in tandem. This originally unaired piece of television had been recorded on the 27th of September 1963, and was absolutely ripped to pieces by Sidney Newman, head of drama at the time, and often credited as being one of the originators of Doctor Who as a whole. It's a fascinating piece of TV history, especially when considering that this version of An Unearthly Child could have been the one that made it to our screens. This noteworthy broadcast attracted an audience of around 1.6 million viewers. For 1991, this is quite a low figure, lower than any first broadcast of all existing Who stories up to this point, but I think there's a few factors that call for its defence. First off, the pilot aired on BBC Two, BBC One's sister channel, that generally received lower viewership across the board. Second, by the turn of the 1990s, the incorporation of satellite television into people's homes was becoming far more common, offering them hundreds of new channels to dedicate their time to. Regardless of the viewing figures, this airing of the pilot episode marked the only Doctor Who repeat on terrestrial TV during 1991. However, the following year would prove to be significantly more rewarding in terms of repeat transmissions. The year is now 1992, and the year got off to an exciting start for Whovians, as a new series of repeats began airing over on BBC Two, covering a story from the first 3 Doctors' eras. First up was The Time Meddler, the concluding serial of Season 2, and one that had been considered missing for decades, only being returned to the BBC in 1985. This was the first time the story was to be seen on TV since its original broadcast back in 1965, and as it wasn't yet available on VHS, it was quite the occasion for fans, as many of them would be seeing it for the very first time. Airing on Friday evenings, from the 3rd to the 24th of January 1992, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 2.59 million viewers. Whilst this is a near 6 million drop from its first transmission back in 1965, I would argue that for 1992, and for Doctor Who's standing amongst the general public at the time, this is a surprisingly decent figure to average. Given that it features no major monsters, for nearly 3 million viewers to tune into a story that hadn't been seen on British TV for nearly 30 years is quite the feat. I'm sure many watching were dyed-in-the-wool Who fans, but I could also imagine sections of the general public could have been curious at the very least. Not to mention the competition from other terrestrial channels and satellite television to boot. Also, we have to take note of the chart positions, with 3 of the serial's 4 episodes gaining a place within the top 20, with Part 2 just missing out, finishing up at 21st. Whilst this may seem like a triumph, you've probably sussed out that these positions don't take into account all of the terrestrial channels available, these merely being the placements for BBC Two programmes. Nevertheless, for a 27-year-old Doctor Who story to firmly root itself within the top 20 BBC Two programmes of that week, surely asserts that the franchise wasn't completely dead in the water yet. Whilst repeat screenings were a great opportunity for fans and newcomers alike, there were many who were still clamouring for new adventures. They could happily rely on the output of Virgin Books, which released 6 new stories compared to the previous year's 4, all of which continued the travels of the 7th Doctor, with several major shake-ups along the way. A new trilogy kicked off the year with Cat's Cradle, before standalone stories followed, with Nightshade, Love and War, and Transit. These 3 books are notable for a few reasons, not least for taking into account who wrote them. Nightshade was penned by Mark Gatiss, who would go on to become a writer for the revival of Doctor Who, as well as a successful actor in his own right. Transit was written by Ben Aronovich, the writer behind Remembrance of the Daleks and Battlefield. And finally, we have Love and War, written by relative newcomer Paul Cornell. Having concluded the Time Worm saga the previous year, Paul was proving to be one of the most popular new writers amongst fans. In this adventure, he created the character of Bernice Summerfield, who had gone to travel with the Doctor before eventually starring in her own book series and later countless audio dramas. But that's a little way off in the future, so more on that when we get there. The repeat season continued, with the Mind Robber being chosen to represent the second Doctor's tenure. One of the early stories from Season 6, this 5-part adventure is often heralded as being one of the era's best, with a strong imaginative landscape, and the leads absolutely lapping up every bit of its inherent obtuseness. Going out over 5 Friday evenings from the 31st of January to the 28th of February 1992, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 2.33 million viewers, a 0.26 million decrease from the previous serial. Now, when we take a look at the raw numbers, we can see there's a noticeable dip in viewership with episodes 3 and 4, both of which pulling in roughly 1.5 million. The lower audience could be put down to a later time slot for transmission. Due to BBC Two's coverage of the Winter Olympics in Albertville, France, episodes 3 and 4 went out almost an hour later than the serial's other parts, at around 7:40 PM. There's no direct evidence to suggest that this is the prime factor, but I would argue that it's the most likely one, especially given that episode 5 gained the highest viewership of the Adventures repeat, at 3.46 million. In terms of chart placements, whilst data for episodes 3 and 4 are unavailable, we can see that the remaining instalments all reach BBC Two's top 20 programmes for their respective weeks. Part 5 in particular is able to reach the top 10, but only just. Again though, keep in mind all the potential competition from other channels. For a 24-year-old Doctor Who story to get repeated and gain a top 10 placement, I'd argue that isn't to be sniffed at. Meanwhile, as the expanded media of the VNAs continued to grow from strength to strength, the VHS range of Classic Who continued to regularly release stories, at an even more rapid rate. The selection of adventures fans could purchase on video throughout 1992 included The Caves of Androzani, Robot, Logopolis, Castrovalva, The Claws of Axos, The Twin Dilemma, Earthshock, The Aztecs, and Mordrin Undead. These standard releases were accompanied by the Pertwee years, Tom Baker years, and now also special tapes dedicated to the programme's most iconic monsters. The Daleks and Cybermen had their earliest moments issued as part of the Years series, but as interesting as these special releases were, there were 2 more from 1992 that really got fans talking. Firstly, you had the abandoned Season 17 finale, Shada, which had originally been scheduled for broadcast back in 1980. Using a combination of shot footage and new linking material featuring Tom Baker, the story finally saw the light of day, with its VHS release also including a copy of all 6 scripts. This was the first attempt to complete a Doctor Who adventure, and despite seeming quite simple by today's standards, it established a benchmark, and certainly wouldn't be the last of its kind. But the most exciting VHS release of 1992 arguably had to be of the Season 5 opener, The Tomb of the Cybermen. Originally having been broadcast in 1967, the serial was never repeated in the UK, and for several decades was believed to be one of many adventures from the 1960s to be deemed lost, with no surviving copies remaining in the BBC's archive, or any archive of several international broadcasters. However, all of that changed at the start of 1992, when copies of all 4 episodes were found in Hong Kong. Mere months later, the story was issued on VHS, becoming one of the best-selling tapes of the entire range. Back on TV, the last of the spring repeats for 1992 would be The Sea Devils, a Season 9 adventure that would represent the Third Doctor's time on the telly. Going out across 6 Friday evenings from the 6th of March to the 10th of April 1992, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 3.2 million viewers, a 0.9 increase from the previous serial. It's great to see the viewership of these repeats increase as time rolls on, particularly for such a belter of a story as The Sea Devils. All 6 episodes pulling over 3 million viewers, not too shabby at all for a 20-year-old adventure. Each episode also is able to find a place within the top 20 BBC Two programmes for their respective weeks, with episode 4 coming the closest to reaching the top 10, finishing at 12th place. So what was it about The Sea Devils that helped it triumph over the previous 2 repeats? Well, this may sound somewhat shallow, but this was the first of the spring repeat season stories to be filmed and shown in colour. Believe it or not, there are viewers out there who don't enjoy black and white telly, for numerous reasons. Furthermore, amongst the casual viewer base, Jon Pertwee remained one of the most recognisable Doctors at that time, being the first Doctor for millions of children who were now in their adulthood. Finally, the presence of the Sea Devils themselves surely sparked some memories amongst the British public. Several fans and non-fans alike retell the story of when they saw the creatures emerging from the sea, how that was for many their earliest encounter and memory of Doctor Who. But regardless of which of these reasons could be the leading factor, it is great to see that some enthusiasm could still be drummed up for the TARDIS teams of old, especially with seemingly endless amounts of competition that could have drawn those viewers away. And with the conclusion of The Sea Devils, so marked the end of the 1992 spring season of Doctor Who repeats. By combining the average results from the 3 stories, we can calculate that the average viewing figures for this season of repeats stands at around roughly 2.7 million viewers. Whilst these may be far from the 5 Faces of Doctor Who back in 1981, these 3 adventures, I'd argue, pack a decent punch given the limbo the TV series was in by 1992. The Sea Devils was the clear winner, but for the Hartnell and Troughton tales to still pull in over 2 million viewers despite their age and being in monochrome is a small victory all to itself. With the wealth of material available to fans throughout 1992, there was one last little surprise to help seal off the year. Another story was scheduled for a repeat transmission over on BBC Two, the Season 8 finale The Demons being the lucky candidate. Arguably one of the most popular serials of the Jon Pertwee era, amongst both fans and cast alike, but why now was it slated for this one-off re-airing? Well, for many years, all but one episode of The Demons existed in just black and white, as opposed to the colour it was originally shot in. However, thanks to new restoration techniques of the time, the colour signal from American recordings was used as the basis to help restore the original colour in the black and white tele-recordings held here in the UK. Therefore, The Demons could be showcased to British audiences in colour for the first time in over 20 years. Quite an exciting achievement, one which was publicised well, with a segment on the restoration appearing on Tomorrow's World, and extensive continuity announcements and trailers leading up to the repeat's transmission. Going out over 5 consecutive Fridays from the 20th of November to the 18th of December 1992, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 2.5 million viewers, a 0.7 decrease from the previous repeat back in the spring. Whilst only one episode of The Demons is able to just about crack the 3 million mark, the rest of the serial holds firmly above 2 million, with each episode gaining a spot within the top 30 charts for BBC Two programmes, all except for episode 3, for which no data can be found. So, how come this repeat didn't turn out to be the most successful of the bunch in 1992, especially given the restoration back to colour? It's all speculation, of course, but I think the time of year didn't do the serial any favours. This repeat was originally meant to begin in early September, but was pushed back to November, which meant it would air through December, which is the busiest time of year for television, as that's when all the festive programming begins. And if you thought competition was rife throughout the rest of the year, well, at Christmas it's overwhelming. And with the wealth of new programmes available during the holiday season, a 20-year-old Doctor Who repeat, no matter how impressive regarding the restoration, was simply not going to cut it for vast chunks of the viewing public. Still, regardless of the somewhat anticlimactic impact, The Demons repeat performed just as well as the other adventures rescreened that year. And if you thought 1992 was a solid year for repeats, just wait until we get to 1993. But of course, those repeats were just regarding terrestrial television. Believe it or not, satellite television would welcome Doctor Who with open arms, specifically the UK TV network, which was originally formed via a collaboration between Thames Television and none other than the BBC. Launching on the 1st of November 1992, the original standalone channel, UK Gold, would be a host to several classic British programmes, one of which would go on to become one of their best performers on the channel, that of course being Doctor Who. On the new channel's second day, the 2nd of November 1992, at 5:30pm, viewers could tune in to a repeat showing of the very first episode, An Unearthly Child. For almost every day thereafter, the show would be broadcast in story order, with both episodic and omnibus editions of most classic adventures being screened to audiences. With satellite dishes becoming a more common appearance on UK households, these showings on UK Gold provided many a viewer with their very first Doctor Who experience. These repeats would continue on UK Gold in heavy rotation throughout the 1990s, lasting into the 2000s, and even past the show's revival in 2005. The very last repeat transmission would be of John Pertwee's swan song, Planet of the Spiders, presented in an omnibus edition going out on Sunday the 14th of April 2007. Doctor Who would continue to live on the UK TV network, moving over to Gold's sister channel, UK TV Drama, but for 15 years, particularly during the 1990s, UK Gold offered Doctor Who an ever-valuable lifeline. By airing the programme so consistently for several years, those who had perhaps heard of the show or wanted to relive some classic adventures could now do so almost every single day. Whilst I may not be able to present viewing figures for these repeats, partly because there are so many of them and much of that data is unknown, I wanted to give UK Gold the credit it deserves. For without its dedication to Doctor Who during the wilderness years, it could be argued that the show may not have shone so brightly in the minds and hearts of the wider viewing public. So, with exciting new adventures in print, the return of a long-heralded classic to the archives, and a season of repeats which garnered respectable viewing figures, not to mention the now almost daily repeats going out on UK Gold, was all of this enough to convince the bigwigs of the BBC to bring back Doctor Who? Sadly, in 1992 at least, it wasn't to be. Though rumours continued to circulate that there were actually talks going on with other production companies, some even based in America. Steven Spielberg's name was even mentioned at one point. Would any of it come to fruition? Only time will tell. But first, there's a major celebration we have to account for. The year is 1993, and Doctor Who was celebrating its 30th anniversary. After the extravagant events that occurred during the 10th and 20th celebrations, fans were hopeful that this was going to be the year in which Doctor Who would make a triumphant return to television, or certainly to have it announced at the very least. No new series on TV was to materialise, but that didn't mean that plans weren't underway to try and celebrate this national institution in some form or another, and one avenue that kick-started the 30th anniversary celebrations was another series of repeat transmissions. After the somewhat successful run seen in the early months of 1992, which featured a story from Doctors 1, 2 and 3, a loose continuation was seemingly in order. To mark the 4th Doctor's era, Season 12's Genesis of the Daleks was chosen to represent Tom Baker's 7-year stint in the TARDIS. Having already been repeated as an omnibus in 1975, and as two 45-minute episodes in 1982, Genesis would now be repeated in its original 6-part format for the first time since it debuted almost 18 years prior. Going out on BBC Two across 6 consecutive Fridays from the 8th of January to the 12th of February 1993, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 2.2 million viewers. A 0.3 decrease from the Demon showing, which had only concluded a few weeks beforehand. Now, obviously this is a far cry from the original transmission's 9.6 million average back in 1975, but every episode manages to stay above 2 million, though they never seem to crack the halfway point to 3 million. Chart-wise, however, for BBC Two programmes of their respective weeks, all episodes managed to stay within the top 30, aside from Part 6, for which the chart data is not known. But as always, let's examine the potential reasons as to why the opener for the 1993 spring repeat season didn't perhaps gain a higher viewership as some would have expected. As mentioned, Genesis of the Daleks was and still is one of the most repeated Doctor Who serials on terrestrial television. The 9.6 million viewing average of the first broadcast dropped to 7.6 million for the omnibus that Christmas, and down further to 5 million for the 1982 airing, and now to just 2.2 million for 1993. So, after having multiple chances to already enjoy the classic adventure, some audiences could have perhaps simply passed and decided on watching something else. One factor that often gets overlooked too is that by the time this repeat started, in early 1993, Genesis had been available to purchase on VHS for over a year, having been bundled with the Sontaran Experiment back in the October of 1991. So given that this was airing one episode a week, those who perhaps caught the opener simply couldn't wait that long, and perhaps went out to purchase the serial on video. After all, why wait 6 weeks to watch the complete adventure when you could just spend a tenner and watch it all in one go? There's two sides to every debate, of course, but the point remains that the fact Genesis was available in full on VHS could have potentially damaged any terrestrial repeat chances of higher viewing figures. The usual factors for 90s retransmissions are also still in effect too. Doctor Who's gradual erosion in the wider public consciousness, airing on BBC Two instead of BBC One, and the ever-growing list of new channels providing viewing competition. Despite the lukewarm figures for Genesis, however, further repeats were scheduled to cover the Doctors of the 1980s, so we'll see shortly if they fared any better. With the 30th anniversary ploughing on, a lot of the focus across all media was to look back, to aptly celebrate the 3 decades worth of adventures that we've shared with the Doctor. However, for the Virgin New Adventures books, they continue to look to the future, delivering new stories featuring the 7th Doctor and friends on a now monthly basis. Fresh paperbacks that readers could enjoy throughout 1993 include The Highest Science, The Pit, Deceit, Lucifer Rising, White Darkness, Shadowmind, Birthright, Iceberg, Blood Heat, The Dimension Riders, and The Left-Handed Hummingbird. Given these new stories were now coming out every month, it was clear that the VNAs had forged out their place within the Whoniverse. Whilst not every release received critical praise from fans, they were popular enough that they would continue to be published for several years to come, with Ace's character being substantially developed, and Bernice Summerfield was quickly becoming a fan favourite too, despite at this point having only appeared in print. Meanwhile, back on television, with the conclusion of Genesis of the Daleks, it was time for a 5th Doctor adventure to take to the airwaves. The story chosen was in fact his swan song, The Caves of Androzani, and considering that this is arguably one of, if not the best 5th Doctor story, it's hardly a surprising choice. Going out on BBC Two across 4 consecutive Fridays from the 19th of February to the 12th of March 1993, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 1.82 million viewers, a 0.38 drop from the previous serial. This marks the first terrestrial Who repeat of the 1990s to fall below the 2 million mark, with all but Part 1 falling below that threshold individually as well. Chart-wise, whilst we don't have data for Parts 2 and 4, 1 and 3 both finished at 27th, inching towards falling out of the top 30 programmes for BBC Two entirely. Did a similar set of factors that potentially damaged the Genesis repeat hit the Caves of Androzani one also? Well, in terms of a more convenient alternative being available, absolutely. The Caves of Androzani had been released to VHS in the January of 1992, being available to viewers for over a year by the time of its retransmission. And given that it was a single tape release, it was probably even cheaper to pick up than the Genesis double pack. In TV terms, whilst this marked the first repeat of Caves since its original airing back in 1984, you could potentially draw public association into the mix too. Tom Baker was arguably the most recognisable Doctor come the early 90s, given his long stint in the role, and with how many children of his era were also now adults, reminiscing about his adventures. Whilst today they have gained the appreciation they rightfully deserve, back in the 90s, the 80s Doctors weren't looked on as fondly. Many of these negative views stem from creative decisions rather than necessarily the actors themselves, but amongst the wider public, the 5th, 6th and 7th Doctor weren't exactly as popular as their 70s counterparts. So whilst it's purely speculation and theory, I'd argue that the general viewership may not have been as interested in the events on Androzani, particularly compared to the Tom Baker repeat, which had the Daleks to help further pique interest. However, there were 2 more repeats scheduled to go out in the spring of 1993, so we'll see shortly if they could raise the viewing figures back above the 2 million mark and continue to celebrate the changing faces of Doctor Who for its 30th birthday. On home video, the VHS range of Doctor Who would also bask in the celebratory spirit, with most 1993 releases showcasing a 30th anniversary banner underneath the diamond logo. And quite appropriately, this would be the busiest year of the range yet, with new releases hitting shop shelves every single month. The 30th anniversary year releases included Terminus, Enlightenment, Image of the Fendal, The Demons, Terror of the Autons, Silver Nemesis, Vengeance on Varos, The Keeper of Traken, The Invasion, Doctor Who and the Silurians, The Curse of Peladon, Resurrection of the Daleks, The Two Doctors, Planet of Evil, and Dragonfire. These standard releases were accompanied by some special box sets, the first of their kind for Doctor Who on VHS. The Dalek tin included The Chase and Remembrance of the Daleks, and a special TARDIS-shaped tin contained all 14 episodes of The Trial of a Time Lord. With at least one story from each of the 7 Doctors making its way to VHS in 1993, there truly was something for everyone. And with the 30th anniversary banner adorning most of their cases, it felt like the brand was in a triumphant and celebratory phase, despite the continued absence of new adventures on television. What was on television, however, was the run of classic repeats, the third of which focusing on the Sixth Doctor's tenure and the story chosen being Revelation of the Daleks, the concluding story from season 22. Going out on BBC Two across 4 consecutive Fridays from the 19th of March to the 9th of April 1993, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 1.59 million viewers, a 0.23 decrease from the previous serial. This time around, not a single episode is able to surpass the 2 million mark, Part 4 faring the worst with just 1.2 million, one of the lowest viewing figures scores to date. Chart position-wise, fortunes were starting to slip also, with Parts 1 and 3 just about holding on in the top 30, whilst the chart data for Parts 2 and 4 is not known. But why was this happening? Why were the average viewing figures not remaining consistent or increasing as they had done during the 1992 run of repeats? I'd cite the public association with the 80s Doctors and the programme as a whole for being one potential factor in this lower viewership. With this era of the show not yet gaining much of the appreciation it has today, perhaps general audiences weren't as enthused to re-watch what, in my opinion, is one of the best classic Who adventures of all time. It was the 4-part edit sold overseas that was retransmitted, as opposed to the original 2 45-minute episodes. You could argue that some viewers, particularly fans, would have been frustrated that this chopped-up version was being shown instead of the original edit, but that's purely speculation. Interestingly, Revelation wasn't available on VHS back in 1993, and would continue to evade the format until its eventual release alongside Planet of the Daleks in 1999. So you would have thought its unavailability on home video would have boosted its chances of higher viewing figures over the Tom Baker and Peter Davison repeats, but sadly it wasn't to be. Despite the dwindling viewership on these adventures, there was one serial left to air as part of the spring season, and the wider 30th anniversary celebrations. We'll see momentarily whether it could reverse the fortunes of the last few stories. But Doctor Who was a franchise not merely relegated to one kind of media. Aside from television, books and home video, one medium in which the Time Lord dabbled his hands in this year was radio. The Paradise of Death was a 5-part audio drama, going out on BBC Radio 5 over 5 consecutive Fridays from the 27th of August to the 24th of September 1993. Starring John Pertwee as the Third Doctor, Elizabeth Sladen as Sarah Jane Smith, and Nicholas Courtney as the Brigadier, the serial was generally well received. It wasn't Doctor Who's first foray into radio though. The 1985 serial Slipback takes that honour. But with a script penned by former producer Barry Letts, it felt right at home amongst the Third Doctor's era. Viewing, or listening figures I should say, are generally unknown, but the serial performed well enough that this wouldn't be the last time this leading trio would be heard on the airwaves. The Paradise of Death would see a release on cassette in late 1993, be published as a Last Target novelisation in 1994, be issued on CD in 2000, with a subsequent release as part of a box set in 2011, and more recently is available to download digitally, as well as getting a special release on vinyl as part of Record Store Day 2020, paired with the other 90s radio serial, The Ghost of N-Space, but more on that when we get there. We've come now to the last of the spring season repeats for 1993, and the story chosen to represent the 7th Doctor's era was the opening serial for season 26, Battlefield. An odd choice to many, given that several other McCoy-era serials already had cemented themselves as iconic classics, but this adventure did contain the Brigadier and Unit, so perhaps that could have been the primary reason? Going out on BBC Two across 4 consecutive Fridays from the 23rd of April to the 14th of May 1993, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 1.3 million viewers, a 0.29 drop from the previous serial. Heading closer and closer to falling below a million, it's a shame that instead of finishing on a high, as the repeats did in 1992, the 1993 slate just went from a subdued bang to a tiny whimper. All 4 episodes once again failed to crack the 2 million mark, with parts 2 and 4 both recording the lowest point in viewership with just 1.2 million each. No chart data is available for this repeat, but to hazard a guess, I reckon these episodes would have been in the bottom ranks of the top 30 or have fallen further down the ladder. Do the factors we've looked at provide us with any clues into this continued drop in audience? Sylvester McCoy's era of the show, at least by 1993, was starting to gain appreciation for some of its later serials, such as The Curse of Fenric or Survival. Battlefield, ironically, is arguably the sole story from season 26 that doesn't get the high praise of its peers from that same year. For many, it probably represents what they felt was wrong with late 80s Who. Some clunky dialogue, production values and special effects that weren't up to snuff with what was happening at the cinema, all that sort of stuff. Aside from being on BBC Two and facing hundreds of channels worth of competition, Battlefield, like Revelation of the Daleks, wasn't yet available to purchase on VHS, eventually getting a release on the format in 1998. So you'd have hoped more viewers would have tuned in to see the Doctor's final collaboration with the Brigadier, but it just didn't happen. Let's take a look now at the spring season of repeats of 1993 and see what we can deduce overall. By combining the average viewing figures from the 4 serials, we can calculate that the viewing average for this season of repeats stands at around roughly 1.7 million viewers, a 1 million drop from the average seen of the 1992 season. Some would argue this result was perhaps inevitable, with the novelty of Doctor Who being repeated wearing off quickly, despite it being the 30th anniversary year. However, these numbers do mark a sad decline, from where Genesis starts with 2.2 million to where Battlefield ends at 1.3. However, similar to how The Demons was re-airing late in 1992, one serial would take to the airwaves towards the end of 1993, but more on that when we get there. For now, it's time to truly celebrate, with Doctor Who taking centre stage for its 30th anniversary special. The 30th anniversary special is Dimensions in Time. After capturing the first and second Doctors, the Rani sets out to trap the Doctor's remaining incarnations in the East End of London. There, the Doctors and their companions are pulled across the timelines, and are hounded by the Rani's menagerie of monsters. This story is comprised of 2 mini-episodes, which began airing on the 26th of November, 1993, and concluded the following day on the 27th. Here are the individual viewing figures for both episodes, and no, your eyes don't deceive you, they really are that high. Both episodes soar above 13 million viewers, a feat the programme hadn't achieved since 1979. Despite the ever so slight drop between parts 1 and 2, it's clear that audiences wanted to see how the evil schemes of the Rani turned out. But I tell you what, regardless of what people may think of Dimensions in Time, it's such a good feeling to see Doctor Who do so well in the viewing figures tables again. When looking over at the weekly charts, it's another return to form. Part 1 manages 15th place, with Part 2 taking Doctor Who back into the top 10 for the first time in years, with a 10th place ranking. So what was it about Dimensions in Time that got millions upon millions glued to their screens? How did this all come to be? Well, you can't discuss Dimensions in Time without first discussing the Dark Dimension. It's a long tale with many twists and turns, one we'll go into in a bit more depth perhaps another time, but I'll summarise it as best I can. The idea of a brand new standalone adventure to help celebrate the 30th anniversary had been discussed the year before. Having worked at BBC Enterprises since the TV show had gone off the air, former producer John Nathan Turner, citing the strong video sales of classic serials, believed that a 90-minute direct-to-video special episode could be written and produced in time for the 30th anniversary itself in November of 1993. The story, which ended up being titled as Lost in the Dark Dimension, would see Tom Baker play a wizened old version of the Fourth Doctor, with the other surviving Doctors appearing in smaller cameo-esque appearances, something they understandably weren't too keen on. Appearances were planned from Daleks and Cybermen, and it was all to be helmed by Graham Harper, the director of some of the best-loved 80s Who adventures. After numerous delays, swapping from being a direct-to-video project being shown on BBC One, to funding setbacks and a whole host of other issues, the Dark Dimension project was ultimately cancelled in the summer months of 1993. With just months left until the big day itself, the mantle once again fell to John Nathan Turner to put something together to mark the occasion. The result was Dimensions in Time, a short 2-part 13-minute adventure to be showcased as part of the BBC's annual Children in Need charity telethon. Doctor Who was no stranger to working with Pudsey Bear, Terry Wogan and co, with the 20th anniversary special, The Five Doctors, getting its UK premiere on the telethon 10 years prior. With precious little time to film this new story, most of the allocated shooting time was performed on the set of the BBC's biggest soap opera, EastEnders, for which several prominent characters would end up featuring in the special itself. To mark this historic Doctor Who EastEnders crossover, surely the publicity machine would work itself into an overdrive. That may be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's fair to say that Dimensions in Time got a fair amount of hype leading up to its transmission. Promotion started in October, with a 3D week coming up, for which Children in Need would be part of. Trailers started appearing featuring Sylvester McCoy appearing from the TARDIS into a viewer's living room, showcasing the funky 3D glasses you would have to wear for the new special. From early November, audiences could purchase the colourful specs for 99p, for which 25p of that purchase would go directly to Children in Need. Behind-the-scenes footage was showcased as part of a Pause for Pudsey broadcast on Sunday the 7th of November over on BBC One. Meanwhile, in the print world, Doctor Who was to receive an honour that hadn't been bestowed on it for a decade. To help promote Dimensions in Time, as well as highlighting the programme's 30th anniversary, Doctor Who would once again adorn the front cover of the Radio Times, its first time doing so since 1983. The Weekly Listings magazine was jam-packed with features regarding the upcoming special, as well as articles detailing the history of the programme. With audiences well and truly ready to experience this new 3D adventure, with 5 different Doctors no less, the last bit of major promotion came the day before Part 1's broadcast. On Thursday the 25th of November, 7th Doctor Sylvester McCoy and former companion Deborah Watling appeared on BBC One's Good Morning to discuss the programme and promote the forthcoming special. With the stage well and truly set, Dimensions in Time was introduced in a unique segment set within the world of Noel's House Party, one of the BBC's biggest Saturday night programmes of the era, hosted by the ever-popular Noel Edmonds. With the TARDIS arriving in Crinkly Bottom, John Pertwee emerges to ridicule Noel for a little bit, before the pair and the studio audience don their 3D glasses as the adventure begins. The story itself is, well, God, how do I summarise Dimensions in Time? I've already done a more in-depth look at this special as part of my Weird Who series, so if you'd like to learn more about the wackiness within, then definitely check that video out. Back here though, given that the viewing figures for Dimensions in Time were so high, was the competition over on ITV just so lackluster that it didn't stand a chance against the combined might of 5 Doctors, and 2 severed heads if you want to be technical? Well, for the 7.5 minutes that Part 1 was on the air, its immediate competition on the other side was the TV movie Voyage of Terror, the Achille Lauro affair, which, bless its heart, seemingly has been consigned largely to TV history, bowing to the might of Dimensions in Time, but I digress. To be fair, Dimensions pulled in around 4 million more viewers than the previous 20-minute segment in the Children in Need telethon, so if an extra 4 million tuned in just for a few minutes of Doctor Who, I think that tells you something about the dedication of the viewership. Part 2 went out as part of that Saturday's Noel's House Party, creating a fitting continuity, as Mr. Edmonds was able to help introduce both instalments. ITV that day was screening the romantically themed game show Blind Date, which had been on air since 1985 and was hosted by former 60s pop star Cilla Black. Despite being nearly a decade old, the programme was still incredibly popular, pulling roughly around 10 million viewers at this time. So for a short 5.5 minute Doctor Who segment to eclipse this light entertainment juggernaut by a good few million is quite the feat, and one I'd argue shouldn't be brushed aside. In the 30 years since its original broadcast, it's fair to say that Dimensions in Time is a rather divisive story in the realm of fan opinion. Whilst many will ridicule it for its rather rushed nature, lack of an in-depth plot, complaints that certain doctors or companions don't get adequate time in the spotlight, etc, but regardless of all that, one point I would argue in Dimensions in Time's favour is that it has fun in absolute abundance. It's a breezy adventure, but one filled with many moments that certainly made me smile. It's great to see tons of the old companions pop up here and there, and that extends to the surviving Doctors as well. And if you lean into the inherent madness of it all, it's a rip-roaring good time. Given that it was made for charity, the likelihood of Dimensions in Time being released on home media is highly unlikely. Some would argue that's probably for the best, but I live in hope that one day, Dimensions in Time will get a lot more love than it has done over the past 3 decades. Oh, and of course, it's canon.
So now your other selves are all free.
Certainly we are difficult to get rid of.
Dimensions in Time may not have been what viewers had hoped for in terms of a 30th anniversary special. However, in the weeks leading up to and immediately after its transmission, one story had been chosen to showcase Doctor Who on its original home, BBC One. This was quite the move, as this would mark the first time the Time Lord would appear on the channel since his last new adventure back in 1989. Perhaps if the viewing figures proved to be strong enough, the BBC would finally be convinced? But hang on, out of nearly 150 adventures, which one would be chosen to represent the programme as a whole? The answer would be Season 10's Planet of the Daleks from 1973, a serial featuring one of the most popular Doctors alongside their most deadly adversary. Going out for the first time in 20 years, that's bound to drum up at least some attention. Going out on BBC One over 6 Fridays from the 5th of November to the 17th of December 1993, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 3.6 million viewers, a massive 2.3 million increase from Battlefield's repeat average just months earlier. All 6 episodes sit comfortably within the 3 million range, with episode 2 managing to just crack 4 million. Unfortunately, chart data isn't available for this transmission, but given this is BBC One, the flagship channel of the corporation, these numbers I would argue imply that Doctor Who would have been some way off placing within the top 40. However, one thing is for certain, the show got an incredible boost with this transmission, so what helped it achieve that? The most obvious factor would arguably be that Planet of the Daleks was being shown on BBC One as opposed to BBC Two. The flagship channel also tended to garner far more viewership than its younger brother, but could those numbers perhaps be even higher? I'd argue yes, if it wasn't for the immediate competition on the channel's biggest rival, ITV. As these episodes were going out at 7:30 PM, this placed them directly opposite the other side's biggest programme, Coronation Street. The cast of The Cobbles had been an unbeatable rival to Doctor Who in its final few years of the late 80s, and whilst this repeat performed admirably, especially given its age, Corrie was gaining 3, if not 4 times the amount of viewership, So, from the get-go, you probably wouldn't have been blamed for thinking this repeat didn't stand much of a chance ratings-wise. A factor that I think also helped was that the adventure wasn't available to buy on VHS, releasing several years later in 1999. Furthermore, given that this was to tie in with the 30th anniversary, the 6 episodes were aired under the banner of Doctor Who and the Daleks, with special mini-documentaries preceding each episode. One in particular, Missing in Action, is notable for explaining the story of the many lost episodes of Doctor Who, as well as explaining why that week's episode, Part 3, was only available in black and white. The first 3 episodes were aired over consecutive Fridays in November, taking a 1-week break due to the Children in Need telethon that year, and of course Dimensions in Time lest we forget. But if this repeat airing of Planet of the Daleks proved anything, it was that Doctor Who, against the toughest ITV competition, not to mention the various satellite channels, still had a firm audience on BBC One. For a 20-year-old serial to air at a primetime evening slot on a Friday and achieve nearly a 4 million viewing average, that alone showcases that the franchise still had so much to offer, especially if new adventures were to be commissioned. But despite the phenomenal numbers of Dimensions in Time, and the decent figures for the Planet of the Daleks repeat, as 1993 was drawing to a close, there was still no word of a new series entering production. However, just 2 days after the conclusion of Dimensions in Time, on Monday the 29th of November, 1993, a special documentary was set to air on BBC One, to help conclude the 30th anniversary celebrations for Doctor Who. 30 Years in the TARDIS was at the time the ultimate love letter to the programme, featuring interviews with former cast, crew and production members, brand new linking material featuring said people, as well as a wealth of archive clips from all eras of the show's history. I would love to show you what the viewing figures were for this documentary, but unfortunately, despite extensive research, I just can't seem to trace them. Given that it aired at 8 PM, a nice evening slot, I would have hoped it would have achieved at least 3 million viewers, particularly after the big promotional boost via Dimensions in Time and the semi-successful repeat of Planet of the Daleks, which was between its 3rd and 4th episode when 30 years went to air. Sure, these days it's been superseded by further documentaries, but at the time, it was certainly seen as the definitive documentary on Doctor Who. An extended cut was released to VHS in 1994, and that same extended cut appeared on DVD in 2013, bundled together with Shada as part of the Legacy Collection box set. But as 1993 wound off, the big dream had yet to come to fruition. Despite all the celebratory efforts, all the new books, videos, the ever-faithful Doctor Who magazine, the spring season of repeats, the BBC One Planet repeat, and the critically panned but numerically successful Dimensions in Time, it seemed that nothing was swaying the BBC or any other production company into bringing Doctor Who back for the 1990s. Alan Yentob, then controller of BBC One, teased fans a little at the end of 30 Years in the TARDIS, giving renewed hope that perhaps soon, the blue box would show up on viewers' screens again. But after 4 years of waiting, the chances of that actually happening seemed to grow fainter by the year. The year is now 1994, the 30th anniversary is well and truly over, and Doctor Who fans once again began to play the waiting game, wondering whether this could be the year in which the Time Lord would make their triumphant return to television. But as we've seen so far in these wilderness years, there wasn't exactly a lack of Who content that would allow them to keep busy during the meantime, and for the 3rd year running, said content would be led by a series of repeats. After a strong start in 1992, and a less viewed but semi-successful year in 1993, 1994 would begin again with a run of classic Doctor Who adventures over on BBC Two. The story chosen this time was the season 10 finale, The Green Death, featuring John Pertwee as the 3rd Doctor, the departure of Katie Manning as Jo Grant, and the fiendish killer maggots, a resultant of our misuse of the environment. Going out on BBC Two across 6 consecutive Sundays from the 2nd of January to the 6th of February 1994, here are the viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at 1.2 million viewers, a colossal 2.4 million drop from the previous serial, which had only concluded a little over 2 weeks ago over on BBC One. No episode manages to break 2 million, with episode 3 arguably showing one of the worst individual results in Doctor Who history, with just 0.8 million, or 800,000 viewers. Whilst no chart data exists for this repeat, it's probably for the best, as I could arguably guess that no episode cracked the top 30, or even top 40 or 50. So, what happened here? The Green Death was and is revered as being one of the best stories of the 70s and of the show period. So, why weren't people tuning in for the serial's first repeat since Christmas of 1973? One notable change in this season of repeats is the day and time in which the episodes would go out. 1992 and 1993 saw repeat screenings go out on Friday evenings, generally considered to be a pretty decent time slot for any channel. However, beginning in 1994, Doctor Who was now airing on Sunday afternoons, with all 6 episodes of The Green Death starting at noon. Daytime television viewing is generally lower across all channels and has been this way for decades. Even at the weekends, some audience members will undoubtedly be working, and those that aren't are probably doing some other activity to fill out their weekend, as opposed to watching television, a tradition typically reserved for the evening by millions of households. So with the new daytime slot, you could argue that Doctor Who had shot itself in the foot before it had even left the gate. Whilst I'd argue the shift in the day and time slot is the prime reason for the Green Death's lacklustre result, perhaps a case of burnout had also occurred amongst the general viewing public. Franchise burnout happens a lot more commonly these days, with properties such as Star Wars and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but after lots of exposure in various forms of media throughout 1993, more casual audience members could have perhaps grown a little tired of Doctor Who. However, speculation aside, this was not the way in which the 1994 repeat season hoped to start off, and unfortunately, the viewing figures yielded would bring about severe consequences, the first of which was the cancellation of a VHS release for The Green Death. Originally planned for shortly after the repeat, sometime in 1994, the 6-part serial wouldn't see a release on home video until 1996. Second, and perhaps more damning, we'll come to shortly. Meanwhile, in the world of print, the Virgin New Adventures continued to pump out one new book every month of the year, 1994 being the first year in which this happened. The 12 new books featuring the 7th Doctor, Ace and Bernice Summerfield were Conundrum, No Future, Tragedy Day, Legacy, Theatre of War, All-Consuming Fire, Blood Harvest, Strange England, First Frontier, St. Anthony's Fire, Falls the Shadow, and Parasite. The more mature novels continued to be eagerly read by fans of the show, with some gaining high praise, whilst others gaining critical derision. But whilst the VNAs were welcome for providing new stories for the incumbent characters, a brand new book range from Virgin focused on the first 6 Doctors. The Missing Adventures, as they were dubbed, told new stories for these past Time Lords, adapting the more fleshed out and mature detail that the VNAs had become known for. 5 books in the Missing Adventures range made their debut in 1994, these being Goth Opera, Evolution, Venusian Lullaby, The Crystal Bucephalus, and State of Change. So now with not one but 2 successful book lines under its belt, Virgin was now able to draw from the vast palette of Doctor Who completely, and provide young and upcoming writers with the chance to showcase their talents and ideas. Back in the landscape of TV, despite the poor performance of The Green Death, a second serial had been selected to be repeated. The choice this time was Season 13's Pyramids of Mars, one of the most highly praised and beloved stories from the Tom Baker era, and again from the show as a whole. Going out on BBC Two over 4 consecutive Sundays from the 6th to the 27th of March 1994, here are the individual viewing figures for this repeat, which averaged out at just 1 million viewers, a 0.2 decrease from the previous serial. It's a sad state to see, not helped when you notice that Part 3 can't even muster above 1 million, and the other 3 parts only just manage. Once again, no chart data is available, but given these numbers, that's probably for the best. Did similar factors that hit The Green Death also affect this renowned adventure? Well, it certainly was a bizarre choice to repeat, certainly by 1994. Pyramids of Mars had been available to buy on VHS for almost 10 years, first releasing as an omnibus edition back in 1985, later gaining a reissue in that form in 1987, before being released in its original episodic form in February of 1994, around the same time this repeat started transmitting. So tell me, what do you think the general public would rather do? Make time during Sunday lunch to watch the serial over 4 weeks, or just pop down to Woolworths and pay a tenner for the complete story on one VHS tape? I understand doing tie-ins, but surely you'd wait until after the repeat concludes before releasing the episodic version to home video? Once again, the day and time slot Pyramids went out in arguably did it no favours, likewise with all the competition that ran across the airwaves. Sadly, this would mark the last terrestrial repeat of a Doctor Who adventure for over 5 years. With the poor results seen by these 2 serials, no further repeats were scheduled, leaving viewers with only what was available on VHS or the constant repeats on UK Gold, provided that they had the appropriate satellite TV setup. With an average viewership of just 1.1 million across the 2 stories, it's hardly surprising more repeats didn't follow for the 1994 season. No further attempts were made in 1995, or for most of the 90s in general. It wouldn't be until late 1999 when Doctor Who would see itself repeated on terrestrial airwaves, but more on that when we get there. It's a shame they ended here with such low viewing figures, especially in the case of Pyramids of Mars. For a story that gained almost 14 million viewers when it was shown at Christmas 1975, to sink to just a fraction of that almost 20 years later is really heartbreaking to say the least. But whilst you couldn't get your fix on the BBC, you could certainly indulge yourself in the ever-expanding library of VHS releases. After the anniversary year that was 1993, The VHS range continued to steadily release more classic stories to the format, alongside some special releases too. Whilst not putting out as many tapes as they did in 1993, BBC Video would issue the following: Arc of Infinity, Inferno, Ghostlight, The Visitation, paired together with Black Orchid, Destiny of the Daleks, The Seeds of Doom, The Rescue, paired together with The Romans, Kinder, and Snake Dance. These titles were getting their first release on VHS, however there were more tapes that came out in 1994 that were re-releases of past titles. These included The Ark in Space, Day of the Daleks, and Pyramids of Mars. All three had seen home video releases in the 1980s, however these showcased the adventures in a truncated omnibus format. Now they could be viewed complete and unedited, as the cover sticker brightly proclaims. 1994 also saw the last releases in the Years series, this title focusing on 6th Doctor Colin Baker, the actor himself providing new links between archived clips. For whatever reason, tapes dedicated to Peter Davison and Sylvester McCoy's tenures on the programme were neither produced nor released. The last VHS of 1994 to cover is more than 30 years in the TARDIS. The original broadcast of the documentary, back in 1993, was 50 minutes in length. This tape proved to be something of a definitive edition, as the runtime was extended to 90 minutes and contained tons of new scenes and clips. So, whilst not boasting as many releases as 1993, the VHS slate for Doctor Who in 1994 continued to be consistent, and varied in terms of what it offered to consumers. And so 1994 ran its course. Another year in which a wealth of Doctor Who content was available in one form or another, yet a new television series remained less of a rampant want and more like a distant dream. Unbeknownst to many at the time, work was beginning to take place behind the scenes, in an attempt to truly resurrect the programme for a new generation, but more on that when we get there. The year is now 1995, and the year started off with a notable absence of Doctor Who on terrestrial television. The last 3 years of classic repeats was not embarking on a fourth run, instead leaving it to the VHS range and the satellite repeats on UK Gold to help scratch that itch for viewers. But with no repeat broadcast scheduled to air on terrestrial television, Virgin Books, perhaps more than ever now, bore the responsibility of continuing to publish brand new Doctor Who media for eager fans. In their 5th year of new adventures, 12 more books featuring the 7th Doctor were published. The titles in question were Warlock, Set Piece, Infinite Requiem, Sanctuary, Human Nature, Original Sin, Sky Pirates, Zampa, Toy Soldiers, Head Games, The Also People, and Shakedown. 1995 proved to be quite the notable year for the range in terms of companions. Ace would bow out in February's release Set Piece, whilst the Doctor and Benny would be joined by 2 new companions, Chris and Roz, in Original Sin, which came out in June. The most notable adventure of the year was arguably Human Nature, written by Paul Cornell. By this point, Cornell was well respected amongst the Who fandom, often cited as being one of the best writers across the entire range. This story in particular would be adapted for the modern series of Doctor Who, appearing together with the Family of Blood during Series 3 in 2007, again written by Paul Cornell. The Missing Adventures line blossomed in its 2nd year, following the New Adventures example of publishing a brand new book every month of the year. The 12 releases featuring past Doctors included The Romance of Crime, The Ghosts of Endspace, Time of Your Life, Dancing the Code, The Menagerie, System Shock, The Sorcerer's Apprentice, Invasion of the Cat People, Menagra, Millennial Rights, The Empire of Glass, and Lords of the Storm. With all 7 Doctors receiving regular new stories, fans were certainly given a wide variety in terms of the adventures they could indulge in, not to mention the continued releases of classic TV serials on VHS. If you thought the VHS range was slowing down after the mammoth 30th anniversary slate, then their release for 1995 was here to prove you dead wrong. A whopping 21 releases came out across the year, the standard tapes being The Android Invasion, Carnival of Monsters, The Mark of the Rani, Time and the Rani, Frontier in Space, The Sea Devils, Warriors of the Deep, Paradise Towers, Survival, and The Monster of Peladon. Once again, 3 stories got a re-release, presented in episodic form for the first time compared to their omnibus releases back in the 1980s. These were Spearhead from Space, Death to the Daleks, and The Robots of Death. The one-off pilot, K9 and Company, got a VHS release this year, as did the 6 stories that made up Season 16, the Key to Time season. Released in pairs between April and June, the 6 serials were notable for their case spines forming a rather colourful and appealing image. However, arguably the most exciting release of 1995 would be the twin release of The King's Demons, together with the 20th anniversary special, The 5 Doctors. Now, the latter had been released a few times before, as a slightly edited release in 1985, and its original unedited form in 1990. However, this new version was notable for being dubbed the Special Edition. With new material, new effects, and new music, This was the first time a classic Who adventure had been repackaged and released in this way, and similar to what we saw with the presentation of Sharda, it certainly wouldn't be the last time Doctor Who stories would receive this treatment. So, with their busiest year so far in terms of releases, BBC Video's Doctor Who range showed no signs of slowing down anytime soon. Particularly impressive, given that New Adventures hadn't been seen on TV for more than half a decade by this point. One avenue I'll briefly touch upon is the release of new live-action adventures, created by fans. Whilst none of them strictly acquired the Doctor Who licence from the BBC, several fans had begun forming their own production companies and releasing content featuring actors associated with the programme. Real Time Pictures was one such company, created by Keith Barnfather in 1984. Having been one of the founding members of the Doctor Who Appreciation Society during the 1970s, Barnfather had amassed a wide range of Who-related contacts over the years, which helped form the basis of perhaps Real Time's most notable series, Mythmakers. A series of interview-based programmes often hosted by Nicholas Briggs, an up-and-coming actor who would later voice the Daleks for the revival of the Doctor in the 21st century. However, one interesting piece of Real Time's output was the 1995 drama Downtime. Having licensed certain elements from Doctor Who, this adventure saw Nicholas Courtney, Deborah Watling, and Elizabeth Sladen return to their roles of the Brigadier, Victoria Waterfield, and Sarah Jane Smith respectively. Being a sequel to the Yeti stories of the 1960s, it serves to expand these characters further, including their connections to one another, as well as introduce new ones, such as Kate Lethbridge-Stewart, the Brigadier's daughter. Played here by Beverly Cressman, this character would eventually see a huge revival in the 2010s, appearing in the main programme, now played by Gemma Redgrave. So, whilst not widely talked about today, fan productions such as these equally help play their role in sustaining the memory of Doctor Who, whilst providing fans with new stories to sink their teeth into, whilst waiting for the eventual return of the television show. However, as 1995 was nearing its end, once more, no such new TV series emerged, or was even scarcely talked about. What was talked about was an upcoming TV movie, one starring Paul McGann as the brand new 8th Doctor, and would be debuting in May of 1996. Whilst coming out of nowhere for some, the wheels had been turning on this project for quite a while, but we'll delve more into that story in our next instalment.
Paul McGann is Doctor Who, tonight at 8:30 on BBC One.
So those are the ratings details for the first part of the Wilderness Years. I hope you enjoyed this numerical look back at what many see as one of the darkest times in the history of the programme, how its legacy would be formed for the 1990s, and the numerous attempts getting it back up and running. If you want to see more Doctor Who content, then I highly recommend that you check out Rassilon Productions. This lad makes some cracking content, including his own series of audio adventures, Doctor Who Dark Days. Check out his work and subscribe to his channel whilst you're at it. If you want to read more about Doctor Who in the making of it, then I highly recommend the Complete History series of books, which I used as reference for this video. If you want to keep up to date with this series, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and if you want to see new episodes of the series early, then you can, by supporting us on Patreon, or by becoming an AMTV staff member right here on YouTube. Please consider leaving a like, subscribing to the channel, and leaving your thoughts on this section of the Wilderness Years in the comments section below. I've been Adam Martyn from AMTV, and we'll see you next time for the TV movie and beyond. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Jen Samantha Pringle, Hooks Media, Ben Freeman, Ethan Carberry Holt, The Welsh Lady, Bruce Danton, The Broken Kitsumanoid, and Cooking at Nans and DIY, our AMTV staff members.